Original Sin. I am Reverend Imran. Original Sin. I am Reverend Imran Shuker. Freedom put to the test. God created man in his image and established him in his friendship. A spiritual creature, man can live this friendship only in his free submission to God. The prohibition against eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil spelled is out. For in the day that you eat, for it you shall die. The tree of the knowledge of good and the evil symbolically evokes the insurmountable limits that man, being a creature, must freely recognize and respect with trust. Man is dependent on his Creator and subject to the laws of creation and to the moral norms that governs the use of freedom. Man's first sin. Man, tempted by the devil, let his trust in his Creator dies in his heart and abusing his freedom, disobeying God's command. This is what man's first sin consisted of. All subsequent sin would be disobedience toward God and lack of trust in His goodness. In that sin man preferred himself to God and by that very act scorned Him. He chose himself over and against God, against the requirement of his creaturely status and therefore against his own good. Constituted in a state of holiness, man was destined to be fully divinized by God in glory. Seduced by the devil, he wanted to be like God, but without God, therefore God and not in accordance with God. Scriptures portray the tragic consequence of this first disobedience. Adam and Eve immediately lost the grace of original holiness. They become afraid of the God of whom they have conceived a distorted image, that of a God jealous of his prerogatives. The harmony in which they had found themselves, thanks to the original justice, is now destroyed. The control of soul, spiritual faculties over the body is shattered. The union of man and woman becomes subject to tensions, their relations henceforth marked by lust and dominations. Harmony with creation is broken. Visible creation has become alien and hostile to man. Because of man, creation is now subject to its bondage to decay. Finally, the consequence explicitly foretold for this disobedience will become true. Man will return to the ground out of which he was taken. Death makes its entrance into human history. After that first sin, the world is virtually inundated by sin. There is Cain's murder of his brother Abel and the universal corruption which flows in the wake of sin. Likewise, sin frequently manifested itself in the history of Israel, especially as fidelity to the God of the covenant and as transgression of the law of Moses. And even after Christ's atonement, Sin raises its head in countless ways among Christians. Scriptures and the church traditions constantly recall the presence and universality of sin in human history. Revelation makes known to us is confirmed by our own experience, for when man looks into his own heart, he finds that he is drawn toward what is wrong and sunk in many evils which cannot come from his good Creator, up often refusing to acknowledge God as his source. Man has also upset a relationship which should link him to his last end, and at the same time he has broken the right order that should reign into himself as well as between himself and other men and all creatures. All men are implicated in Adam's sin, as Saint Paul affirms. By one man's disobedience many, that is all men, were made sinners. Sin came into the world through one man and death through sin. And so death spared to all men because all men sinned. The apostles contrast the universality of sin and death with the universality of salvation in Christ. Then as one man's trespasses led to the condemnation for all men, so one man's act of righteousness led to the acquittal and life for all men. Following Saint Paul, the Church has always taught that the overflowing coming misery which oppresses man and their inclination toward evil and death cannot be understood apart from their connection with Adam's sin and the fact that he has transmitted to us a sin with which we are all born afflicted, a sin which is the death of the soul. Because of this certainty of faith, the Church baptized for the remission of the sin even tiny infant who has not committed personal sin. How did the sin of Adam become the sin of all his descendants? How did the sin of Adam become the sin of all his descendants? How the whole human race is in Adam's as one body of one man. By this unity of the human race, all men are implicated in Adam's sin, as well as implicated in Christ's justice. Still, the transmission of original sin is a mystery that we cannot fully understand. But we do not know by revelation that Adam had received original holiness and justice, not for himself alone, but for all human nature. By yielding to the temper, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected the human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. It is a sin which will be transmitted by the propagations to all mankind. That is by the transmission of a human nature deprived of original holiness and justice. And that is why original sin is called sin only in an analogical sense. It is a sin contracted and not committed, a state and not an act. Although it is proper to each individual, original sin does not have the character of a personal fault in any of Adam's descendants. It is a deprivation of original holiness and justice. But human nature has not been totally corrupted, it is wounded in the natural powers proper it, subject to ignorance, suffering and the dominations of death, and inclined to sin. Inclination to evil that is called concupiscence. Baptism, by imparting the life of Christ's grace, erases original sin and turns a man back toward God. But the consequences for nature weakness, and inclined to evil, persist man and summon him to spiritual battle. The Church teach on the transmission of original sin was articulated more precisely in the fifth century, especially under the impulse of Saint Augustine, reflection against the Pelagianism, and in the sixth century, in opposition to the Protestant Reformation. By the natural power of free will, and without the necessary help of the God's grace, lead a morally good life. He thus reduced the influence of Adam's fall to bad example. The first Protestant reformations, on the contrary, taught that the original sin has radically privated man and destroyed his freedom. They identified the sin inherited by each man with the tendency to evil, which would be insurmountable. The Church pronounced on the meaning of the data of revelation on original sin, especially on the meaning of the data of revelation. Thanks for watching. Have an eternal home. God bless you all.